Welcome to the deep dive. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. A city, immense, sprawling, surrounded by dramatic rocky hills, filled with magnificent temples and bustling markets, the vibrant heart of a powerful empire that dominated southern India for centuries.
Hmm.
Now picture it gone, reduced to spectacular ruins, overgrown, silent for hundreds of years. Today, we're not just going to explore those ruins, we're going to take a deep dive into how this once great place, Vijayanagara, the city of victory, flourished from the 14th to the 16th century, and how, after its fall, it was pieced back together by historians, archaeologists, and even the whispers of local memory.
It's an incredible story.
It really is. And we have a truly fascinating stack of sources guiding us on this deep dive. We're talking about everything from the very first survey maps drawn by colonial administrators, detailed archaeological findings from decades of excavation, stone inscriptions that literally record history in rock.
Right, the direct voices from the past.
Exactly. And the incredibly vivid accounts left by foreign travelers who walked these streets when the city was alive, plus insights from local literature.
A real mix of perspectives.
Absolutely. Our mission: to unpack this rich material layer by layer. We want to understand what tectonic forces brought Vijayanagara into being, what made it so significant, how it managed its vast territory and complex relationships, how it ultimately met its end, and crucially, what made the city itself such an extraordinary place. Think of this as your shortcut to really grasping the essence of this remarkable imperial capital.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, when we look at a site like Vijayanagara through the lens of these diverse sources, is that we're not just studying a set of historical ruins.
No, it's more than that.
Yeah, we are peeling back layers of history, exploring the complex processes of empire building, understanding how power was projected and maintained, how trade fueled global connections, and perhaps most importantly, how our knowledge of the past is actively constructed over centuries.
Constructed. That's a good way to put it.
Right, because different people with different agendas, from colonial surveyors seeking administrative knowledge.
Like Mackenzie.
Exactly. To priests preserving sacred memory, to foreign visitors simply observing what they saw. They all contribute pieces to a much larger and often incomplete puzzle. It's about seeing history not as a fixed story, but as something we continually rediscover and reinterpret.
That's a perfect frame for this. Let's unpack this right from the beginning then. How did we even find out about this once great city after it fell into ruin? It's not like it remained a visible function capital forever.
No, it certainly didn't. I mean, the city was sacked and abandoned after a major battle in 1565.
Right, Talikota.
So for centuries, it existed primarily as ruins within a landscape known locally by different names, most prominently Hampi. The formal process of bringing it back into historical consciousness for the wider world, particularly the world of scholarly study and mapping, really starts in 1800.
1800.
With a figure named Colonel Colin Mackenzie.
Ah, yes, I remember that name from the material. He was a British engineer and antiquarian working for the English East India Company at the time, someone deeply embedded in the colonial administration that was, consolidating power in India.
Exactly. And the source material we have is quite upfront about his motivations. Mackenzie wasn't just some disinterested scholar wandering the landscape, far from it.
Yeah.
He was an employee of the East India Company, and his interest in places like Vijayanagara was explicitly linked to governance. He genuinely believed that by studying ancient Indian institutions, laws, and customs, the British could gain valuable knowledge that would make it easier for them to govern the territory they were colonizing.
So practical knowledge for ruling.
Very much so. He saw this historical study as a practical tool for administration. He even described the South before British influence in somewhat dismissive terms as having struggled under miseries of bad management, sort of implying that British rule represented a kind of benign influence.
That framing definitely reveals the colonial context of his work.
Absolutely. It's crucial context.
So with that practical administrative motivation, how did he actually begin his investigation of this vast ruin site?
His very first step, according to the material, was preparing the first survey map of the site.
A map. Standard colonial practice.
A formal, systematic mapping exercise. Yes, a characteristic tool of colonial power and administration. But here's where it gets really interesting. Mackenzie's initial information, the knowledge that guided his survey and pointed him to the key areas, didn't come solely from simply exploring the wilderness.
Oh, where did it come from?
It relied heavily on existing local knowledge, specifically on the oral traditions and memories preserved by priests associated with the Virupaksha temple.
The temple that stayed active.
Exactly. The one that remained in worship even after the city's abandonment, and the shrine of the local goddess Pampadevi.
So the city, even though it was in ruins and no longer functioning as a capital, hadn't been entirely forgotten by the people who lived nearby. It lived on in their stories and religious practices.
Precisely. That local memory, particularly the name Hampi, which we understand is derived from the goddess Pampadevi, was absolutely fundamental.
Hampi from Pampadevi. Got it.
These local custodians of tradition guided Mackenzie to the core areas of the city, the places that held significance in the local lore, essentially pointing him to the remains of the imperial capital that had been sacked and deserted after the battle in 1565.
So it wasn't a discovery in the sense of finding something completely lost.
Not at all. It was a process of bringing a place known and remembered in local tradition to the attention of a wider world through the systematic documentation methods of the colonial era. It's a powerful example of how local knowledge plays a vital role in historical rediscovery.
That combination of formal, systematic surveying by an outsider and the indispensable guidance of local memory is fascinating. What other steps were taken in this long process of bringing Vijayanagara back into the historical light?
Well, following Mackenzie's initial mapping, the documentation process continued and expanded. From around 1856 onwards, for instance, photographers began systematically documenting the numerous monuments at Hampi.
Ah, the visual record. That must have been huge.
It was a really significant development because it created visual records, photographs that could be studied by scholars anywhere in the world, far away from the remote physical site. This allowed for much broader academic engagement.
Made it accessible.
Exactly. Then, relatively early in the process, beginning in 1836, epigraphists got involved.
Epigraphists, meaning people who study inscriptions, like writing carved into stone.
Exactly that. They started the painstaking work of identifying, collecting, and deciphering the incredibly numerous inscriptions found etched onto temple walls, stone pillars, and other structures throughout Hampi and the surrounding region.
What kind of information would those ancient texts, literally carved into the rock centuries ago, actually provide to researchers?
Oh, these inscriptions are absolutely invaluable. They are primary sources that provide concrete dates, names, and details. They often record important events during the reigns of the Vijayanagara kings.
Like specific battles or decrees.
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
Or lists of royal grants of land or resources to temples or individuals. And they provide crucial information about the kings themselves and the powerful local rulers known as Nayakas, who govern territories within the empire. They offer narrative context and specific data points that bring the history to life.
So you have the physical location mapped out, the visual records captured by photographers, and then this layer of textual evidence inscribed in stone. How did historians manage to pull all these different kinds of threads together to create a coherent picture of the city and the empire?
The process involved exactly that collation and synthesis. Historians pieced together the puzzle by combining the archaeological findings from the ground, the physical remains of the monuments themselves, identified and mapped by surveyors and archaeologists,
Okay, the physical stuff.
with the detailed chronological and political information gleaned from the stone inscriptions. They then added the rich, albeit sometimes subjective, accounts left by foreign travelers, like the Portuguese Domingo Paes and Fernão Nunes.
The guys who saw it thriving.
Exactly, who visited the city while it was still a bustling capital and described what they saw in incredible detail. And importantly, they incorporated insights from local literature written in the various languages spoken within the empire: Telugu, Kannada, Tamil, and Sanskrit.
So a real multidisciplinary effort.
It's this multi-layered approach, drawing on diverse sources across different time periods of research and documentation, that allowed scholars over the past 2 centuries to reconstruct the history of both the city and the vast empire it commanded.
That really highlights how complex and collaborative historical understanding is. It's rarely based on one single discovery or source, but rather on weaving together a tapestry from many different kinds of evidence, often across generations of scholars.
Absolutely. Each type of source provides a unique window, but also has its limitations. It's by reading them against each other, comparing and contrasting the information, that we can begin to build a more complete, nuanced, and reliable picture of the past.
Okay, that gives us a solid understanding of how we rediscovered Vijayanagara centuries later. But let's step back in time now. What about when it was actually a living, breathing, powerful entity? The sources tell us the empire was founded in the 14th century.
Yes, the empire's origin story, supported by both traditional accounts and the epigraphic evidence we just mentioned, points to its founding in 1336.
1336, okay.
The key figures credited with this are two brothers, Harihara and Bukka.
And in its prime, this empire was immense, wasn't it? Stretching all the way from the Krishna River in the north down to the southern tip of the Indian Peninsula.
Huge territory.
And the material we looked at really emphasizes that this enormous territory encompassed people speaking a multitude of different languages and following diverse religious traditions.
That point about diversity is absolutely crucial for understanding Vijayanagara. Governing such a large and varied territory, incorporating different linguistic and religious groups, presented significant administrative and political challenges.
I can imagine.
It necessitated the development of a strong, centralized state structure capable of exerting authority over this vast and diverse population. It also meant the empire had to maintain constant military readiness, facing potential challenges both internally from regional powers and externally from rival kingdoms.
Who were their main competitors on the regional stage during this period?
Their primary rivals were situated on their northern frontier. These are the various Deccan sultanates, which were Muslim-ruled kingdoms.
Okay.
And to the northeast, the Hindu Gajapati rulers of Orissa. The source material makes it clear that the competition between Vijayanagara and these neighbors wasn't just about abstract territorial control. It was specifically focused on controlling the most economically valuable resources.
Ah, the money and food.
Exactly. This included the fertile river valleys, which were rich agricultural areas supporting large populations and generating significant revenue, and seizing control of the wealth generated by lucrative overseas trade routes that passed through the region.
It sounds like a constant state of tension and competition then.
Often, yes. But it's important to note, as the source material does, that these interactions weren't solely characterized by conflict. Despite the political and sometimes religious differences, there was significant cultural exchange happening across these frontiers.
Really? Even between rivals?
Yeah. The rulers of Vijayanagara didn't just clash with their neighbors, they also borrowed concepts and building techniques from them, particularly architectural styles that had developed in the sultanates through their own interactions with local Indian traditions.
Interesting.
They then, crucially, adapted and developed these borrowed ideas further within their own distinctive style. This architectural synthesis, blending elements, is a fascinating testament to the porosity of these cultural boundaries, even in times of conflict.
That's a great insight that even rivals can influence each other culturally. And they were also consciously building on the strong local traditions of the areas they were incorporating into their empire.
Absolutely. The sources remind us that the areas that eventually became part of the Vijayanagara Empire had a long and rich history of powerful regional states. Dynasties like the Cholas in Tamil Nadu and the Hoysalas in Karnataka.
Dumb names.
Right, they'd existed there for centuries before Vijayanagara and were renowned for their extensive and elaborate temple patronage, responsible for magnificent structures like the Brihadishvara Temple at Thanjavur or the Chennakeshava Temple at Belur.
Incredible temples.
The Vijayanagara rulers, who referred to themselves using the traditional South Indian royal title of Rayas, consciously built upon these established religious and architectural traditions. As the source puts it, they literally took these existing traditions to new heights with their own grand constructions, demonstrating continuity while also asserting their imperial scale.
That blend of incorporating deep local heritage, borrowing strategically from rivals, and then innovating with scale and style sounds like a powerful formula for forging a new imperial identity. What about the economic engine that powered all of this, the prosperity and trade that allowed for these grand projects and constant military readiness?
The economy of Vijayanagara was deeply intertwined with the military needs of the empire, particularly its reliance on cavalry.
Horses. Always horses.
As the source material notes, successful warfare in this period depended heavily on having large numbers of effective war horses. This made the import of high-quality horses, especially from regions like Arabia and Central Asia, absolutely vital for the Vijayanagara rulers, just as it was for their rivals in the Deccan.
And who controlled this crucial trade?
Initially, this lucrative and strategically important trade was largely dominated by Arab traders who brought the horses by sea to the west coast. However, local communities of merchants also participated in these exchanges.
Locals got involved too.
Yes, the source specifically identifies a community involved in this as Kudirai Ketis, which literally translates from Tamil or Malayalam as horse merchants.
Kudirai Ketis, okay. And then The arrival of the Portuguese in 1498 seems to have been another significant shift in these dynamics, right?
Yes, their arrival had a considerable impact. The source points out that the Portuguese established trading and military stations along the crucial west coast. What made them particularly influential was their superior military technology,
Guns.
especially their introduction and effective use of firearms, particularly muskets, which were relatively new to the region. This military edge allowed the Portuguese to become important, albeit often complex, players in the political landscape, sometimes aligning with or competing for favor with both the Vijayanagara rulers and the various Deccan sultanates.
So adding another layer of complexity to the region.
Definitely.
Beyond horses and military tech, Vijayanagara seems to have been famous for markets and other goods as well. The source mentions spices, textiles, and precious stones.
Absolutely. Trade in high-value goods was a defining characteristic of the city's status and wealth. Vijayanagara was renowned throughout the known world at the time for its markets overflowing with desirable commodities.
A global marketplace.
Pretty much. It boasted a large and prosperous population that created a strong demand for expensive, exotic items, with precious stones and jewelry being particularly notable. But this wasn't just about luxury consumption. The source makes it clear that the significant revenue generated from this extensive internal and external trade contributed directly and substantially to the prosperity and power of the state itself. Taxes and duties on trade were a critical source of income for the Raya.
And we get a truly direct window into the strategic thinking behind encouraging this trade from none other than Krishnadev Raya, arguably the most famous and successful ruler of Vijayanagara. The source quotes his own work on statecraft, the Amukta Malyada.
Ah, yes, this is where it gets really interesting. Hearing the ruler's own words about how to manage his kingdom is invaluable. Krishnadeva Raya wasn't just describing an ideal, he was laying out a clear, pragmatic, economic, and military strategy for strengthening the state.
What exactly did he advise regarding trade and how to handle foreign merchants?
He wrote that a king should actively improve the harbors of his country and so encourage its commerce that horses, elephants, precious gems, sandalwood, pearls, and other articles are freely imported.
So actively foster imports, not just let it happen.
Right. This wasn't passive acceptance of trade. It was a conscious policy of fostering international commerce and specifically promoting the import of strategically important and high-value goods.
And he went even further, detailing how to treat the foreign traders themselves.
Yes, he advised the king to show care and consideration for foreign sailors who might face difficulties, such as storms or illness when arriving in his ports. And then comes the truly strategic part, demonstrating his keen understanding of power dynamics.
Okay, what's the kicker?
He says, make the merchants of distant foreign countries who import elephants and good horses be attached to yourself by providing them with daily audience, presents, and allowing decent profits. Then those articles will never go to your enemies.
Wow, that's statecraft at its finest. It's not just about passively receiving goods. It's about using diplomacy and economic incentives, regular access to the king, gifts, ensuring profitability as tools of power.
Exactly.
It's about building relationships specifically to ensure that crucial military resources like horses and elephants come to you and are actively diverted away from your rivals. He's essentially weaponizing trade policy.
It absolutely underscores the critical, integrated link between trade, the state's revenue, and its military power in the Vijayanagara Empire. Controlling access to and the flow of key imports like high-quality horses and war elephants wasn't just an economic matter, it was a fundamental strategic imperative for maintaining dominance in the region. It's a powerful example of how economic policy served military and political goals.
The source material traces the history of the empire through several different ruling families, indicating periods of change and transition.
That's right. The first significant dynasty was the Sangama dynasty, who ruled from the founding until 1485.
Sangama, okay.
They were followed by a period where military commanders known as the Saluvas took control for a time until 1503.
The Saluvas?
And then the Tuluvas took power.
Oh.
Krishnadeva Raya, the ruler whose insights into statecraft we just discussed, belonged to this Tuluva dynasty.
And his reign from 1509 to 1529 is consistently described in the sources as a period of expansion and consolidation, essentially a golden age for the empire.
It was certainly a high point in terms of military success and territorial control. Krishnadeva Raya was a formidable military leader. He successfully acquired the strategically vital Raichur Doab, the fertile land between the Tungabhadra and Krishna rivers, in 1512.
The Raichur Doab, right.
He also subdued the Gajapati rulers of Orissa in 1514 and inflicted significant, decisive defeats on the Sultan of Bijapur in 1520.
So a time of significant military campaigning. Yet the source material notes that his reign was also marked by unparalleled peace and prosperity within the kingdom itself. How does that work?
Well, the military strength and successful campaigns ensured the empire's security and expanded its resource base. This period of relative peace and prosperity allowed for significant investment in infrastructure and culture.
Okay, makes sense.
Krishnadevaraja is credited with sponsoring the construction of many beautiful temples and adding those immense gopurams, the towering gateways, to numerous important temples across South India, extending the Vijayanagara style and influence.
The iconic gateways.
Exactly. He also founded a new suburban township near the capital, which he named Nagalapuram, in honor of his mother, showing investment even in the urban fabric around the capital. Many of the most detailed and admiring descriptions we have of Vijayanagara come from foreign travelers who visited during or just after his reign, attesting to the city's grandeur and wealth.
But the source indicates that signs of strain and internal weakness started appearing relatively soon after his death in 1529.
That's correct. Without Krishnadevaraya's strong leadership, his successors faced increasing challenges, particularly from rebellious Nayakas.
Ah, the Nayakas again. These military chiefs we've mentioned briefly before.
Yes, they controlled significant resources and forces in the provinces. By 1542, effective central control had weakened considerably, and power at the center shifted to another lineage, the Aravidu dynasty.
Aravidu.
They would technically rule until the late 17th century, but eventually from a different location after the capital city's destruction, reflecting the fragmentation of the empire.
So let's dig a little deeper into these Nayakas. They seem central to both the empire's initial success and its eventual downfall. Who exactly were they?
The source material describes the Nayakas as military chiefs who typically held control over fortified areas. Forts were key centers of power in the landscape and commanded their own armed supporters, essentially their own private armies.
Local power bases.
Pretty much. They weren't necessarily tied to one specific location forever. The source notes that they often moved from one area to another, sometimes accompanied by groups of peasants or settlers who were seeking fertile land to cultivate under their patronage. They generally spoke either Telugu or Kannada.
And their relationship with the king was described as complex, sometimes submitting, sometimes rebelling.
It was a dynamic and sometimes volatile relationship. The Amarnayaka system is identified in the source as a major political innovation of the Vijayanagara Empire, one that was highly effective for military mobilization, but carried inherent risks.
Risks. How so?
Well, the source suggests it likely borrowed and adapted features from the Eta system, which was used by the Delhi Sultanate in North India.
Borrowing again.
Yes, showing another instance of selective borrowing. But the risk comes from the power it grants these commanders.
Tell us more about the structure of the Amarnayaka system. How did it work?
At its core, the Amarnayaka system involved the Raya the king, granting territories to these military commanders, the Amarnayakas, to govern. Their primary responsibility in these assigned territories was to collect taxes and other dues from the various economic groups living there, the farmers, the craftspersons, and the traders.
So they were essentially regional administrators and tax collectors?
Yes, but with that absolutely crucial military dimension that made them different from just civil administrators. The Nayakas were allowed to retain a specific portion of the revenue they collected from their assigned territories.
Okay, they got their cut.
Right. This portion was kept for their own personal expenses, but also, and most importantly for the state, for the specific and mandatory purpose of maintaining a stipulated contingent of soldiers, including a certain number of horses and elephants.
Ah, there are the horses again. So this system wasn't just about regional governance and resource extraction. It was the fundamental backbone of the empire's military strength, decentralizing the maintenance of the army.
Exactly. These military contingents, financed and equipped by the Amara Nayakas using the revenue from their territories, formed the main fighting force. It was this distributed military capacity that enabled the Vijayanagara kings to bring and hold the entire southern peninsula under their control.
So it was key to expansion.
Absolutely. The source also notes that the Nayakas were expected to use some of the revenue they collected for local purposes within their territories, such as maintaining local temples and constructing or repairing irrigation works, which would have also helped consolidate their local influence.
And they weren't completely independent. They still had obligations to the central king.
Yes, absolutely. The system required them to send tribute to the king annually, demonstrating their subordinate status. They are also required to make personal appearances at the royal court, bringing gifts to show their loyalty and submission to the Raya.
So checks and balances.
Sort of. The kings had mechanisms to assert control and prevent any single Nayaka from becoming too powerful. They could, for instance, transfer a Nayaka from one territory to another, preventing them from building too deep a local power base.
This system sounds incredibly effective for both managing a large empire and mobilizing a powerful army across a vast territory. But you mentioned the source points to it contributing to the empire's eventual decline. That seems contradictory.
It does, doesn't it? This raises an important question. How does a system that provides such strength become a source of weakness? The source explains that over time, particularly during the course of the 17th century, the inherent decentralization of the system became problematic.
How so?
Many of these Nayakas began leveraging the regional power they had accumulated their control over resources, forts, and their own standing armies to assert greater independence from the central authority. They started establishing independent or semi-independent kingdoms in their territories, effectively fragmenting the empire.
So the decentralization went too far.
Precisely. This process of decentralization significantly weakened the central imperial structure, making it less able to respond cohesively to threats and ultimately more vulnerable.
So this internal weakening, this fragmentation of central authority, made them ripe for a decisive external blow.
Yes. The final devastating blow to the city itself and effectively to the central authority of the empire came in 1565. This was the Battle of Rakshasi Tungadi, which is also widely known as the Battle of Talikota.
Talikota, 1565. The end date for the city.
Effectively, yes. The Vijayanagara army at this time was led by the chief minister, Rama Raya.
And they suffered a comprehensive defeat.
They were decisively routed. The Vijayanagara forces were defeated by a combined alliance of three of the key Deccan sultanates: Bijapur, Ahmadnagar, and Golconda.
The northern rivals united.
Yes. Following this major victory, the Allied armies marched on the city of Vijayanagara, sacking it extensively. Within just a few years of the battle, the once great capital was completely abandoned, never to be re-inhabited as an imperial center.
So the fall was the result of the sultanates finally uniting against them.
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than simple constant hostility. The source material explicitly highlights that relations between the sultanates and the Rayas of Vijayanagara weren't always antagonistic, despite the frequent periods of conflict and religious differences.
Oh, they cooperated sometimes.
Krishnadeva himself, for example, strategically intervened in the internal affairs of some sultanates, even supporting claimants to power there. He also took pride in adopting the title establisher of the Yavana kingdom, where Yavana was a term originally for Greeks and others from the northwest that came to be applied more broadly, including to Muslims.
Establisher of the Yavana kingdom. Interesting title. Meaning he saw himself as playing a role in their politics, not just being an enemy.
Exactly. And conversely, the Sultan of Bijapur, for instance, intervened in the succession disputes within Vijayanagara after Krishnadeva Raya's death. So the kings on both sides sometimes had a vested interest in the stability or carefully managed instability of their neighbors to protect their own position.
Okay, so it was complex. If they sometimes aided each other or intervened in each other's affairs, what specifically triggered the unified attack by the sultanates at Talikota?
The source attributes the immediate cause of the unified sultanate attack to the adventurous policy of Rama Raya, the chief minister leading Vijayanagara at the time of the battle.
Rama Raya's policy.
His strategy, it seems, was to actively try and play off one sultan against another, perhaps hoping to weaken them individually or gain some advantage. However, this tactic appears to have backfired dramatically.
Uh-oh.
Instead, prompting the sultanates to overcome their own rivalries and unite against Vijayanagara in a decisive confrontation at Talikota.
A fatal miscalculation. That clarifies the political context leading to the battle. Let's zoom in now from the empire to the city itself, the capital of Vijayanagara, the physical space that held all this power and wealth. The source describes it as having a distinctive physical layout and building style.
The location is undoubtedly one of its most striking and enduring features. The city is situated within a natural basin formed by the Tukapadra River, which provides a crucial water source.
The river lifeline.
And this basin is dramatically framed and protected by stunning granite hills and rocky outcrops, which, as the source says, seem to form a natural girdle around the settlement.
Those rocky hills are so iconic in any photograph of Hampi today. You just know it's Hampi.
They are instantly recognizable, and these hills were absolutely fundamental, not just aesthetically or defensively, but practically for water management, especially given that the region is one of the more arid zones of the South Indian Peninsula.
Right, water would be critical.
Numerous streams flow down from these rocky areas towards the Tungabhadra River.
How did the builders and engineers of Vijayanagara leverage these natural water features to supply the city and its agriculture?
They displayed incredible ingenuity. They constructed embankments along these streams, essentially building dams to create reservoirs of various sizes, allowing them to capture and store the seasonal rainwater runoff from the hills.
Clever water harvesting.
The source specifically mentions that elaborate arrangements were necessary to capture this precious water and channel it into the city and its cultivated areas.
And there's a specific example from the early period mentioned in the sources, the Kamalapuram tank.
Yes, the Kamalapuram tank is a prominent example, built as early as the early 15th century by the Sangama kings. Water from the significant reservoir served a vital dual purpose. It was used to irrigate the nearby agricultural fields, which were crucial for feeding the population.
Food supply.
And it was also conducted through a sophisticated channel system directly to the area designated by archaeologists as the royal center within the city walls.
Supplying the elite center, too. There's also the Hiriya Canal mentioned.
The Hiriya Canal is another major waterwork, one of the most prominent features of the landscape around Hampi. It drew water directly from a dam built across the Tungabhadra River itself.
From the main river.
Yes. This canal was essential for irrigating the cultivated valley located strategically between the sacred center and the urban core of the city. It appears to have been a very early construction, potentially built by the initial kings of the Sangama dynasty. These extensive systems highlight the immense effort, planning, and engineering skill required to provide water for a large population, extensive ritual complexes, and productive agriculture in this specific landscape.
When thinking about the city's layout, the description by the Portuguese traveler Domingo Pace gives a sense of it being surprisingly green and well-watered, despite the surrounding arid landscape.
Pace described the city as incredibly sprawling. He mentioned seeing many groves of trees, gardens within and around the houses, conduits of water flowing through various parts of the city, and even artificial lakes or tanks.
Gardens and lakes, wow.
He specifically noted seeing a palm grove and other rich fruit-bearing trees close to the king's palace. His account contradicts the idea of a purely dry, rocky settlement and gives us a sense that the city planners incorporated planned green spaces, orchards, and managed water features extensively within the urban fabric.
And speaking of features that define the physical space, the fortifications were clearly a major, impressive element. Abdur Razak, the Persian ambassador who visited in the 1440s, was highly impressed, mentioning 7 lines of forts.
7 lines. These weren't just a single wall or two immediately surrounding the urban area, which was a common defensive strategy. The source material highlights that these multiple lines of fortification actually encircled a much, much larger area.
Bigger than just the city.
Much bigger. Crucially, they included not just the city core, but also the agricultural hinterland, the fields where food was grown, and even forested areas outside the main settlement. The outermost wall was enormous, linking together those prominent surrounding granite hills, effectively integrating the natural landscape into the defensive system.
How are these massive walls constructed? The source explicitly mentions no mortar or cementing agent was employed. That sounds incredible for structures of that scale. How did they stand up?
It was a monumental feat of engineering and skilled masonry. They used large, slightly tapered, wedge-shaped stone blocks. The ingenious part was that these blocks were held in place simply by their own immense weight and the precise way they were cut and fitted together.
Like a giant stone puzzle.
Exactly, relying entirely on structure and gravity rather than any kind of adhesive like mortar or cement. It's like building a wall out of giant heavy puzzle pieces that interlock securely. The inner part of these massive walls was then filled with earth packed tightly with rubble. The walls were also strengthened and punctuated by square or rectangular bastions projecting outwards at regular intervals.
Why would they make the defensive perimeter so huge, enclosing agricultural land and forest? That seems like it would be incredibly difficult to defend compared to a compact city wall.
This is a key point the source draws attention to, and it reveals a sophisticated, albeit very expensive, defensive strategy. Medieval sieges often aimed to starve the city's defenders into submission, sometimes lasting for months or even years.
Siege warfare. Brutal.
Right. Rulers typically prepared for this by building large granaries inside their forts to store food supplies. The Vijayanagara rulers adopted a far more ambitious strategy. They protected the actual agricultural belt itself by enclosing it within the fortifications.
Protecting the food production during a siege.
Exactly. This meant that during a siege, they could potentially continue cultivating crops and producing food inside the fortified area, providing a sustained supply for the population and troops, rather than just relying on dwindling stored supplies.
That's a remarkable long-term defensive plan, prioritizing ongoing production over just finite storage. It speaks volumes about the resources they could mobilize.
It certainly does. And within this vast fortified area, there were multiple concentric layers of defense. That enormous outermost circuit wall, a second line of fortification around the inner urban complex where most people lived,
Okay, multiple layers inside.
and a third, even higher line of walls specifically surrounding the royal center. Even major individual buildings within the royal center often had their own high walls, creating compounds within compounds. Very secure.
With all those layers, how did people actually get into and out of the city?
Access was strictly controlled through a network of well-guarded gateways punctuating these various wall circuits. These gateways were strategically placed to link the city's interior road network to the major roads leading into Vijayanagara from outside. The source notes that these gateways were not just functional entry points, but were also significant architectural features in themselves, often quite grand.
And they even show evidence of cultural exchange, don't they? We talked about borrowing from rivals.
Absolutely. The source points specifically to the architectural style of these gateways. Features like the arch on the gateway structure itself and the dome built over the gate are described as typical features of architecture that had been introduced and developed by the Turkish sultans further north.
Ah, the Indo-Islamic style.
Exactly. Art historians refer to this blending of styles as Indo-Islamic architecture, highlighting how it developed through the interaction and adaptation of practices from different cultural and religious traditions across the subcontinent. Even the defensive architecture tells a fascinating story of cultural interaction and synthesis.
What about the roads within the city itself connecting all these different areas?
Archaeologists have been able to trace the layout of the internal road network by following the paths through the various gateways and identifying stretches of surviving stone pavement. The roads were generally designed to avoid the difficult, rocky terrain of the hills, winding instead through the valleys and more level areas.
Sensible planning.
Yes. Significantly, some of the most important roads extended in a straight line directly from the gateways of the major temples in the sacred center, and these temple roads were typically lined with pillared pavilions where merchants would set up their shops and bazaars.
So the sacred and the commercial realms were physically and functionally linked via these grand temple avenues. That's a powerful symbolic and practical connection.
Precisely. It powerfully highlights the temple's role not just as a place of worship, but also as a central economic hub and a key venue for public gathering and commerce within the city's layout. And continuing that theme of adaptation and persistence, the source notes that the Nayakas in their own territories continued and even elaborated on these temple-building traditions, constructing some of the most spectacular and enormous gopurams themselves in areas under their control, carrying on the visual display of power, piety, and economic centrality initiated by the Rayas at the capital.
Moving inside those impressive walls and along those roads, the source material distinguishes between different key zones within the city: the urban core where most people lived, the royal center associated with the king and court, and the sacred center focused on religious sites. Let's look at the urban core first, where everyday life would have played out.
This is an area where the archaeological evidence is actually less complete compared to the monumental stone structures of the royal and sacred centers.
Why is that?
That's because, as the source quotes the 16th century traveler Barbosa, the houses of ordinary people were made of much more perishable materials. He said they were thatched, but nonetheless well built and arranged, according to occupations, in long streets with many open places. Because they weren't built of durable stone, these residential structures haven't survived the centuries like the temples and palaces.
So it's harder to reconstruct daily life just from the ruins in that area.
Much harder to see the specific house layout, certainly. But archaeologists have found other things that shed light on who lived there and how they lived. For instance, significant quantities of fine Chinese porcelain shards have been discovered in certain areas, particularly in the northeastern corner of the urban core.
Chinese porcelain. Wow, all the way from China.
Yeah. The source suggests this indicates that these areas might have been inhabited by wealthier residents, likely traders, who could afford such imported luxury goods from distant China, showing the city's connection to global trade networks.
Okay, rich traders live there.
This specific area was also identified as the Muslim residential quarter. What's interesting is that the tombs and mosques found there exhibit architectural features, like their mandapas or pillared halls that resemble those found in the temples of Hampi.
The blending again.
Again, showing the blending and borrowing of styles across different communities within the city.
And for the ordinary residents living in those thatched houses, where would they have obtained water? We talked about the big tanks and canals serving the royal and agricultural areas.
The field surveys conducted by archaeologists indicate that various sources likely served the town dwellers within the urban core. This would have included private and public wells dug into the ground, smaller rainwater tanks constructed to capture seasonal rain runoff at a more local level.
Smaller local tanks.
And even the tanks associated with the many small shrines and temples scattered throughout the urban area. The source notes that the urban core was dotted with numerous shrines and small temples dedicated to a variety of deities and cults, likely reflecting and serving the diverse religious practices of the different communities living there.
Let's shift our focus to the royal center, which the source says was located in the southwestern part of the settlement. The source notes something quite surprising here. It included over 60 temples, even though it's called the royal center. Why so many temples in the royal zone?
This is a crucial point that really highlights the immense importance of temple patronage for the rulers of Vijayanagara. The royal center wasn't purely a secular administrative or residential area. Building, maintaining, and associating themselves with the divinities housed in these shrines was a fundamental strategy for establishing and legitimizing their authority in the eyes of their subjects and the broader empire.
Linking kingship to the divine.
Absolutely. It underscored their connection to the divine and their role as protectors of Dharma.
And the palace complexes themselves within this area.
About 30 building complexes have been identified that are believed to be palace or administrative structures. They are substantial in scale, indicating significant activity and residence. However, the source notes that, unlike the temples, these secular buildings don't seem to have been used for major public ritual functions.
Less ritual in the palaces.
Seemingly. A key archaeological difference is that while the temples were built entirely of durable stone masonry from the base to the tower, the superstructures, the upper parts, multiple floors, and roofs of the secular buildings like palaces were typically made of perishable materials like wood, mud, and thatch.
Ah, so the tops are gone.
Exactly. This is why they haven't survived the centuries, leaving only the stone bases or platforms for archaeologists to find.
Tell us about some of the most distinctive structures in the royal center mentioned in the source. The area identified as the King's Palace enclosure, for example.
This is the largest enclosed complex within the royal center, covering a significant area. However, the source is careful to note that it hasn't yielded definitive proof of being the main royal residence itself. It's perhaps better seen as a complex of structures associated with the king and administration.
Okay, maybe not the palace, but a royal zone.
Right. Within this complex are two particularly impressive platforms, which are among the most notable surviving features.
The audience hall platform and the Mahanavami Dibba.
Exactly. The entire complex is surrounded by high double walls with a street running between them, suggesting a high level of security or controlled access. The audience hall is described as a high platform with numerous slots spaced closely together on its surface.
Slots for pillars.
Exactly. These slots would have held wooden pillars that supported a second floor or roof structure. However, the close spacing of these hypothesized pillars makes it unclear what exactly the large hall on top was used for. Some scholars question if it could have accommodated very large public gatherings.
A bit of a puzzle. And the Mahanavami Dibba, that sounds like a truly massive structure.
It is. The Mahanavami Dibba is a huge, imposing platform, rising to a height of 40 feet from a base, covering around 11,000 square feet.
40 feet high.
Massive. Like the audience hall, there's evidence that it supported a substantial wooden structure on top, which is now completely gone. Its most striking visual feature today is its base, which is covered with elaborate and detailed relief carvings depicting various scenes.
The source strongly links this structure to significant state rituals, particularly the Mahanavami festival.
Yes, the archaeological evidence and historical accounts converge here. The rituals associated with the Mahanavami Dibba likely coincided with the Mahanavami festival. This was a major 10-day autumn festival, celebrated under various names across India, like Dussehra, Durga Puja, Navaratri.
Okay, a big festival.
For the Vijayanagara kings, this festival was perhaps the single most crucial occasion of the year to grandly display their prestige, power, and sovereignty to the population, the Nayakas, foreign visitors, and even themselves.
What kinds of ceremonies and spectacles would take place here during that festival?
The source provides a vivid list drawn from historical accounts. The ceremonies included the worship of images of deities, the significant worship of the state horse,
The horse again.
again highlighting the importance of cavalry and the sacrifice of buffaloes and other animals. The festivities were elaborate spectacles designed to showcase the empire's strength and cultural richness. They included dances, wrestling matches, and grand processions featuring caparisoned horses, war elephants, chariots, and large contingents of soldiers.
A massive display of power.
Absolutely. And crucially, this was the time when the Nayakas and subordinate kings from across the empire were required to attend the court, make ritual presentations, and bring gifts and tribute to the king and his esteemed guests, visibly reinforcing the hierarchy and their submission to the Raya.
These ceremonies sound incredibly symbolic, powerful public performances designed to solidify the king's position at the apex of the empire and demonstrate his control over his subordinates.
They were precisely that, deeply symbolic performances of power, wealth, military strength, and allegiance. The source notes that on the final day of the festival, there was a grand ceremony where the king would inspect his own royal army and the armies provided by the Nayakas in an open field.
Inspecting the troops.
A clear and potent visual display of his command over the combined military might of the empire, despite its decentralized structure.
Yet despite the detailed descriptions linking the Mahanavami Dibba to these grand rituals, the source calls it an enigma. Why is that? What's the mystery?
This is one of those fascinating instances where the archaeological remains don't perfectly align with the historical accounts, leaving questions. The physical platform of the Mahanavami Dibba is large, but scholars question if the space immediately around it, as revealed by archaeology, was truly adequate to accommodate the incredibly elaborate and large-scale processions, musters of troops, and crowds described by visitors like Paynes.
The space doesn't seem big enough for the descriptions.
That's the question. This is where we heavily rely on traveler accounts to fill the gap left by the stone structures alone. Domingo Pace's description of what he called the House of Victory, which seems to encompass both the audience hall and the Dibba area, provides valuable details. He describes beautifully sculpted platforms, a room made of cloth where an idol was housed for worship, and a dais with a throne and royal regalia, adding layers of detail and use that the stone footprint alone cannot convey.
That enigma highlights the challenge of interpreting the past. Sometimes the physical evidence seems to raise questions about the written accounts, or vice versa. What about other notable buildings in the Royal Center? The Lotus Mahal is visually very distinct.
The building known today as the Lotus Mahal is indeed visually striking, with its distinctive multi-lobed arches and tiered structure. Interestingly, that romantic name was actually given to it much later by British travelers in the 19th century.
Not its original name then.
Probably not. Its original function isn't definitively known, which is common for many secular structures lacking inscriptions. However, Mackenzie's early map included a suggestion that it might have been a council chamber where the king met with his advisors, a meeting room. Possibly? Its architecture is particularly interesting because it prominently features arches that the source suggests were possibly inspired by Indo-Islamic building techniques. Another example of that architectural borrowing and synthesis we've discussed, happening even in the heart of the royal complex.
And the Hazara Rama Temple within the Royal Center, its name suggests its purpose.
Yes, the Hazara Rama Temple, meaning Temple of a Thousand Ramas, was a smaller but intricately decorated temple located within the royal complex. It was likely a private temple intended specifically for the personal use of the king and his immediate family, rather than the general public.
The king's private chapel, sorta.
Something like that. While the main images in the central shrine are now missing, the sculpted panels on the inner walls survive and are incredibly detailed. These panels depict continuous scenes from the great epic, the Ramayana. There are also panels elsewhere in the temple depicting processions of elephants and horses.
The presence of elephants and horses in those carvings, even in a private temple, connects back to their immense importance in the empire's military, economy, and perhaps even ritual life.
It certainly does. These animals were not just practical military assets, they held symbolic significance as well. And the source notes that the tradition of building substantial palatial structures and integrating religious symbols was continued and even elaborated upon by the Nayakas in their own regional centers, even after the fall of the Central Empire and the city of Vijayanagara.
So the style lived on.
This suggests that the architectural styles and the associated ideas about displaying power and piety persisted at the regional level, even when central authority had collapsed.
Let's move now to the sacred center, located at the rocky northern end of the city, near the Tungabhadra River. This area seems to have a history that predates the Vijayanagara Empire itself.
It absolutely does. This area is deeply imbued with older layers of sacred geography and tradition. Local traditions connect these dramatic granite hills to the monkey kingdom of Kishkinda from the epic Ramayana, a place of ancient legends.
From the Ramayana, okay.
Other traditions center on Pampa Devi, the significant local mother goddess associated with these hills. Legend has it that she performed penance here to marry Virupaksha, who is considered the guardian deity of the Vijayanagara kingdom and is seen as a form of the great god Shiva.
Virupaksha and Pampadevi.
Their marriage is not just a legend, it's still celebrated annually at the Virupaksha temple today, showing the continuity of this sacred connection across centuries.
So it was already a significant sacred landscape, a place of pilgrimage and local worship, long before the city of Vijayanagara was founded there.
Definitely. The presence of giant temples from the pre-Vijayanagara period scattered among these hills further confirms that this area was associated with multiple significant sacred traditions long before the empire chose it as its capital. It wasn't a blank slate. It was a landscape already charged with religious meaning.
And temple building itself had a deep, long history in this entire region of South India, going back to much older dynasties like the Pallavas, Chalukyas, Hoysalas, and Cholas.
Yes, the Vijayanagara rulers were building on a rich and ancient tradition of temple construction and patronage that had been flourishing in the south for centuries. Rulers across these dynasties consistently encouraged temple building for several interconnected and strategic reasons.
Why was temple building so important for rulers?
It was a powerful way for kings to associate themselves with the divine often. The principal deity of the temple was explicitly or implicitly identified with the king himself, linking royal authority directly to divine power and legitimacy.
And temples were more than just places of worship. They were centers of community life.
Much more. Rulers and wealthy individuals often granted temples extensive lands and other resources, making them economically powerful institutions. Because of this wealth and patronage, temples developed into significant religious, social, cultural, and economic hubs within their communities. They were places of learning, performance, administration, and commerce, not just prayer.
So, for the Vijayanagara rulers, continuing this tradition was also about reinforcing their political power and legitimacy.
Precisely. The source emphasizes that constructing, repairing, and maintaining temples were crucial means for the kings to visibly display their wealth, piety, and power. It was a way to win popular support and gain recognition for their rule. By patronizing these important institutions, they positioned themselves as virtuous rulers, protectors of Dharma, and worthy successors to earlier great dynasties.
It makes perfect sense then that the strategic choice of the Vijayanagara site itself, its location, was likely heavily influenced by the pre-existing important shrines of Virupaksha and Pampadevi.
It was a conscious and strategic choice, leveraging the existing sacred geography and the allegiance it commanded. The Vijayanagara kings went even further than just patronizing the existing shrines. They actively integrated the divine into their imperial identity. They explicitly claimed to rule on behalf of the god Virupaksha.
Ruling for the god.
Yes. Royal orders weren't signed with just the king's name, they were signed Sri Virupaksha, usually written in the Kannada script, acknowledging the god as the ultimate sovereign. They also adopted the title Hindu Suratrana.
That title again?
Which is a fascinating hybrid title. It's a Sanskritized version of the Arabic term Sultan, meaning king, but prefixed with Hindu. This translates literally to Hindu Sultan, a powerful blend of associating their rule with a key Hindu deity, Virupaksha, and adopting an imperial title borrowed from their sultanate neighbors, again showing cultural adaptation and the forging of a unique imperial identity.
That hybrid title, Hindu Sultan, is a really telling detail. They weren't just passively copying older traditions or simply borrowing from rivals. They were actively innovating and synthesizing these elements into something new.
Yes, the source points to other innovations as well that integrated kingship and the divine more closely than before. For instance, the introduction of royal portrait sculpture being prominently displayed within temples, literally placing images of the king in proximity to the deities.
Statues of the king in the temple.
Exactly. Also, the king's visits to temples became formalized as important state occasions, not just private acts of piety attended by the empire's key nayakas and officials. This integrated the religious space and ritual into the political performance of the state's hierarchy and power.
Architecturally, what defines the sacred center built by the Vijayanagara rulers, particularly in contrast to earlier temple traditions?
While building on older styles, a key defining feature of the Vijayanagara period in the sacred center is the sheer immense scale of certain structures. These were specifically designed to project imperial authority and grandeur. This is best exemplified by the Rajagopurams, or royal gateways.
Those huge towers.
Enormous, towering, pyramid-like structures built at the entrances to the temple complexes. They were often intentionally built to dwarf the smaller towers over the central shrines, signaling the temple's presence from a great distance across the landscape.
They sound like powerful visual statements of the king's capabilities and reach, like billboards for royal power.
They were absolutely intended as monumental statements. They were almost certainly meant to remind anyone approaching the temple of the king's immense power, his ability to command the vast resources, mobilize the sophisticated techniques, and organize the skilled labor required to construct such massive, towering gateways.
What other features stood out?
Other key architectural features that were developed or elaborated upon during this period included the construction of numerous mandapas, large pillared pavilions, and the creation of long, extensive pillared corridors that frequently wrapped around the central shrine complexes, creating processional paths and shaded spaces for devotees and visitors.
Let's look closer at the specific temples highlighted in the source material, the Virupaksha temple and the Vithala temple.
The Virupaksha but it was significantly enlarged, embellished, and monumentalized after the establishment of the Vijayanagara Empire, reflecting its importance as the temple of the kingdom's guardian deity.
So they built onto the old shrine?
Extensively. Krishnadevaraya in particular made major additions. He added the large hall in front of the main shrine, known for its beautifully and delicately carved pillars, specifically to commemorate his accession to the throne. He is also credited with building the monumental Eastern Gopuram, one of those towering gateways we discussed.
So the original ancient shrine became just the core of a much larger later imperial complex.
Exactly. The various halls and courtyards added over time served distinct functional purposes within the temple's elaborate ritual life. Some halls were designed as spaces where the images of the gods could be brought out to witness special performances like music, dance, or drama, part of the daily or festival routines.
Spaces for performance.
Others, like the Kalyana Mandapa, were specifically built to celebrate the ceremonial marriages of the deities, a significant part of the temple's festival calendar. Yet others were designed as spaces for the deities to be placed on swings. The source notes that special processional images, distinct from the main immovable images kept in the central shrine, were often used for these festive occasions, allowing the gods to participate more actively in the temple's life.
The Vithala temple also sounds equally fascinating, perhaps representing the empire's broader reach culturally.
It is. The principal deity worshipped at the Vithala temple is Vithala, a form of Vishnu, who was widely worshipped in the region of Maharashtra to the north of Vijayanagara.
A god from Maharashtra, worshipped here.
Yes. The Vijayanagara rulers, introducing and patronizing the worship of this particular deity in their capital in Karnataka, is another clear indication of how they drew on different regional traditions and deities to forge a broader, more inclusive imperial culture that resonated with diverse populations across their vast territory.
Integrating different traditions.
Exactly. Like other major temples, the Vithala temple has various halls, mandapas, and courtyards, and it features a particularly unique and famous shrine that is designed in the shape of an elaborate stone chariot.
The stone chariot, that's incredible. These temples weren't just isolated sanctuaries for worship. They seemed deeply integrated into the city's life, almost like miniature cities themselves.
That's a key characteristic of the Vijayanagara period temple complexes. They were vibrant centers of activity. The source highlights the chariot streets, which were specifically built to extend in straight lines directly from the main temple gopurams.
Streets leading from the temple gates.
Yes. These weren't just ordinary paths, they were grand avenues, often paved with stone slabs, and importantly, they were lined with continuous rows of pillared pavilions. It was within these pavilions that merchants would set up their shops and bazaars, selling everything from provisions to luxury goods.
So the sacred and the commercial realms were literally, physically, and functionally linked via these grand temple avenues. It makes the temple a central point for the entire community, not just worshippers.
Precisely. It powerfully underscores the temple's multifaceted role, not just as a religious site, but also as a central economic hub, a marketplace, and a key venue for public gathering and commerce within the city's layout. And carrying on the traditions established by the Central Empire, the source notes that the Nayakas in their own regional centers continued and even elaborated on these temple-building traditions. They constructed some of the most spectacular and enormous gopurams themselves, extending these monumental statements of power, piety, and economic centrality initiated by the Rayas at the capital out into the provinces.
We've covered the broad sweep of Vijayanagara's history and design, drawing from the early colonial surveys, the traveler accounts, the inscriptions, the buildings themselves, and local traditions. How has modern archaeology, particularly the extensive projects since the late 20th century, built on this earlier work and deepened our understanding?
Well, since the early 20th century, the site has been recognized for its historical importance, and efforts have been made towards its preservation. It was declared a site of national importance in India in 1976 and achieves World Heritage status by UNESCO in 1986.
World Heritage Site status, important recognition.
Absolutely, recognizing its global significance. But the source highlights a major systematic archaeological project that was launched in the early 1980s, specifically to document the vast and scattered material remains of Vijayanagara in incredibly extensive detail.
That sounds like incredibly painstaking work across a massive area. How did they even approach that?
It was monumental. Over nearly 20 years, dozens of scholars from India and around the world participated in this intensive project. They used systematic survey and recording techniques across the entire site, which is spread over many square kilometers.
Square kilometers?
Yes. This involved dividing the vast area into successively smaller squares and meticulously mapping and recording every trace of human activity in every structure they found, ranging from tiny humble shrines and residential platforms to the most elaborate temples and palatial complexes.
So they weren't just focusing on the big, obvious monuments like the temples and palaces.
No, that was the point of the intensive survey, to document everything. This allowed them to trace the layout of the city beyond just the core monumental areas. They found traces of those roads and bazaars we discussed, for example.
How did they find traces of things like bazaars when the shops were made of wood and thatch and would have decayed?
That's a good question. While the perishable structures of the shops and stalls are gone, the archaeologists located the traces of roads and bazaars through surviving features, like the stone pavements of the streets and the stone bases or platforms upon which the wooden pillars of the shops would have rested.
Ah, the stone footprints left behind.
Exactly. These seemingly humble stone elements are all that remain of what must have been incredibly lively, bustling, thriving markets centuries ago.
The source includes a quote from some of the scholars who worked on this project, John Fritz, George Mitchell, and M.S. Nagaraja Rao, that really helps bring the past to life and reminds us that what we see today is only a fraction of the original city.
It's a crucial reminder of the limitations of archaeological evidence focused on stone. They wrote, "In our study of these monuments of Vijayanagara, we have to imagine a whole series of vanished wooden elements, columns, brackets, beams, ceilings, overhanging eaves, and towers decorated with plaster and painted, perhaps brightly."
That quote really helps visualize just how different the city must have looked when it was inhabited. Much more vibrant, colorful, and built up vertically with wooden structures than the stone ruins alone might suggest today.
It emphasizes that much of the city's physical fabric, particularly the residential areas and the superstructures on secular buildings, was made of perishable materials: wood, mud, thatch, plaster, paint. And this part of the city is largely lost to archaeological investigation focused on the stone remains.
Which is where the travelers come in handy again.
And this is precisely where the accounts of foreign travelers become so incredibly invaluable. They provide us with written descriptions that help us reconstruct aspects of the dynamic, vibrant, and colorful life that existed there, which the silent ruins alone cannot convey.
And the source gives a wonderful, vivid example from Domingo Pez about the bazaar, painting a picture of incredible abundance.
He describes walking along a broad and beautiful street, lined with merchants selling their wares. His description of the goods available is quite astonishing. He talks about finding all sorts of luxury items there, Rubies and diamonds and emeralds and pearls and seed pearls and cloths and every other sort of thing there is on Earth and that you may wish to buy.
That sounds absolutely incredible, like walking down a high-end shopping street today, but transported back to the 16th century. The sheer variety and availability of precious goods. Rubies, diamonds, emeralds.
It paints a picture of significant wealth and sophisticated demand within the city. But it wasn't just luxury items. Penn's also noted the presence of an evening fair held on this street, where more common goods were sold.
Everyday stuff, too.
Yeah, such as horses, though probably not the high-end imported ones, fruits, vegetables, and wood. He went on to call Vijayanagara the best provided city in the world, stating that the markets were stocked with provisions, all of which were chiefly and abundantly available.
So abundance and affordability for basic necessities, too, not just luxury goods for the elite. That suggests a broad base of prosperity, or at least provision.
Fernão Nunes, another Portuguese traveler who visited around the same time, corroborates this sense of abundance and affordability for basic goods. He mentions that the markets were overflowing with abundance of fruits, and that everything was very cheap.
Overflowing and cheap. Sounds good.
He also provides a list of meats available in the market, which gives a fascinating, albeit perhaps startling to a modern ear, glimpse into the range of dietary options. He mentions not only expected items like mutton, pork, venison, and various birds.
Okay, standard fare.
But also lists sparrows, rats, and cats and lizards being sold for consumption.
Okay, maybe we'll stick to imagining the gems and spices rather than the full range of the meat market. But that kind of detail from foreign observers who were simply describing what they saw without any political agenda certainly makes the city feel incredibly real and lived in. It takes us beyond the grand pronouncements of kings or the silent testimony of the stones.
It provides a completely different, more grounded layer of understanding, filling in some of the gaps left by the official records and monumental architecture, and offering glimpses of the economic activity and even the daily diet of the people who live there.
So we have this rich, multifaceted collection of sources, the archaeological remains, the painstaking surveys and maps, the stone inscriptions, the visual records, and the detailed accounts from foreign travelers. What do they collectively tell us about Vijayanagara, giving us this incredible insight, and what do they fundamentally leave unanswered? What are the limits here?
The buildings and archaeological evidence are incredibly powerful for understanding the physical city, how spaces were organized and used, the layout of the centers, roads, water systems, the construction techniques and materials employed, the impressive masonry without mortar.
The wedge-shaped blocks?
Right. The defensive requirements, the layered fortifications enclosing farmland, the spread of architectural ideas and cultural influences, like the Indo-Islamic styles in the gateways and palaces, and the messages that the builders or patrons, primarily the kings and nayakas, wanted to convey through these imposing structures: power, piety, legitimacy. When we combine these physical remains with other sources, it helps us interpret the symbols embedded in the architecture and art within their cultural and political context.
Like seeing the blend of architectural styles and connecting it directly to the political and cultural interactions with the sultanates, we can see the history in the buildings.
Exactly. But while these sources tell us a lot about the structures of power, the economy, and the city's physical form, the source material we have is very clear that these investigations, particularly of the architecture and official records, leave significant and perhaps unanswerable questions.
What are some of those crucial questions that remain, questions that these sources can't easily answer?
Well, the source asks about the perspective and experiences of ordinary people, the vast majority of the population, including women and children, who lived in and around the city in those perishable houses. What did they think about these incredibly impressive buildings, especially those in the royal or sacred centers?
Good question. Did they even care?
Right. Would they even have had access to many of these areas, which were likely restricted? Would they have paused to look at the elaborate sculpture on the Mahanavami Dibba or temple walls and try to understand its complex symbolism? Or would they have simply hurried past on their daily business, focused on earning a living?
That's a really important point. The sources we have give us the view from the top, the grand vision of the rulers, but it's incredibly hard to access the viewpoint, the thoughts, and the daily life experiences of the ordinary majority.
Absolutely. The sources were created primarily by or for the elite. And what about the people who actually built these colossal structures? The highly skilled masons, the stonecutters, the sculptors who created the intricate carvings, the laborers who moved the materials.
Yeah, who were they?
Where did they come from? Were they paid laborers? Or perhaps, as was sometimes the case in pre-modern empires, Captives from wars. What kind of wages did they receive, or how were they compensated? Who was responsible for supervising these enormous projects? The logistics of coordinating thousands of workers and materials. How was the sheer volume of building material transported, and where was it sourced from, sometimes from considerable distances?
These are fundamental questions about the society, the labor force, and the organization of such massive undertakings that seem incredibly difficult to answer based purely on the surviving buildings, royal decrees, or foreign visitor accounts which weren't focused on these details.
Yes, the source points out that while the rulers made the big decisions about style, location, and materials, we often don't know who possessed the specialized technical knowledge, the engineers, the architects, the master masons required to actually design and manage such massive construction enterprises, to draw up the detailed plans and oversee their execution.
It really highlights the inherent limitations of relying on certain types of historical sources, particularly the ones that are most likely to survive centuries, like stone monuments or official decrees. They tell one story, but hide many others.
Right. The source offers another powerful example of this limitation and the problem of perspective by contrasting the idealized image of Krishnadeva Raya that would have been presented by a statue placed on a prominent temple gopuram, clearly how the ruler wanted to be remembered and perceived, a symbol of his piety and power.
The official image.
With a much more candid and humanizing physical description given by Domingo Paez, the foreign visitor.
What did Pace say about his physical appearance? How did he really look?
Paez described Krishnadeva Raya as being of medium height and a fair complexion and good figure, rather fat than thin. He has on his face signs of smallpox.
Wow, two completely different portrayals of the same person side by side. The heroic, idealized, even divine image projected on the temple versus the very human, physical reality noted by an independent observer, signs of smallpox and rather fat than thin. It shows how deliberate the public image was.
It's a potent reminder that our understanding of the past is always partial, always constructed from the available evidence. It depends heavily on the sources that have survived, the perspective they offer, whether it's an official, carefully curated ideal, a foreign observer's view, or the silent testimony of archaeological remains and what those sources were intended to record or convey. Continuing research using other potential sources or finding new ways to interpret existing ones might provide more clues to some of these questions, but others, particularly those concerning the subjective experiences and daily lives of ordinary people, may well remain among history's enduring mysteries.
Wow, what an incredible deep dive into Vijayanagara. We've journeyed from its rediscovery, guided by that crucial blend of local oral traditions and formal colonial surveys, explored the rise and eventual fall of the empire, driven by dynamic dynasties, regional rivals, and the ingenious but ultimately risky Amarnayaka system. We've understood the power structures and the vital role of trade, even weaponized trade policy, in fueling its prosperity and military strength. And we've walked virtually through the stunning layered ruins of its urban core, royal center, and sacred center, guided by the insights from modern archaeological analysis, the meticulous mapping, and the wonderfully vivid accounts of ancient visitors like Peywes and Nuniz.
We've seen how an imperial capital was shaped by the fundamental needs of defense, incredibly ingenious water management systems adapted to the landscape, deep-seated religious beliefs that were actively integrated into the state's identity, the dynamics of its powerful economy, and fascinating cultural exchange, incorporating architectural styles and ideas from across the region and even beyond.
And we've also squarely faced the inherent limits of our understanding, acknowledging the significant gaps in our knowledge, particularly concerning the voices and daily experiences of the ordinary people who lived within its walls, the challenges of interpreting complex structures like the Mahanavami Diba, and the hard physical labor performed by the skilled builders who created these magnificent structures, whose stories are largely untold by the stones themselves.
It is a powerful reminder of how much of the past is physically preserved in stones, inscriptions, and written accounts, waiting for us to find and interpret it, but also how much remains elusive, a mystery waiting for potentially new kinds of discoveries, or simply new ways of interpreting the evidence we already possess, asking different questions of the material.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this deep dive? Perhaps this journey serves as a prompt to look differently at historical sites you might visit, not just as static ruins or points on a map, but as complex layers of information left by different people for different reasons across different eras, requiring diverse sources and perspectives to even begin to understand.
Yeah, seeing the layers.
Or maybe it's a poignant reminder that even in the face of the most impressive displays of imperial power and grandeur, capturing the everyday lives, thoughts, and struggles of the vast majority of people remains one of the most challenging and often heartbreaking aspects of historical reconstruction.
This raises an important question, I think. Given how much we've managed to learn by combining just these sources, archaeology, inscriptions, traveler accounts, limited local literature, what else might we be able to uncover about places like Vijayanagar and indeed other historical societies if we could find and integrate more kinds of sources,
What kind of sources?
particularly those that might speak, however indirectly, to the experiences of the people who weren't kings, wealthy traders, or foreign ambassadors, but were simply trying to live their lives within the walls of a city like this?
A question to ponder indeed as we continue our own deep dives into the past. Thanks for joining us for this one.